There was a time in my life when I realized that there were some things I had done I regretted. Of course, the only way to fix this was to go back in time and undo the mistakes of my past. Unfortunately, no one told me what kind of time travel I was doing, and it was a disaster. Let's try to avoid this. I'm DC Ferguson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. From H.G. Wells until now, there have been approximately 1 billion different time travel variations in film, books, and television. The most interesting thing about all these variations is that they're not all done the same way, and since science can't agree on which one would be the right way, the sky is really the limit for us. So we're going to talk about different ways that time travel's been reflected in books and other media. Now, since this is an unproven science we're talking about here, we can get away with playing fast and loose with some of the rules, but there's a whole set of other rules that cause major pitfalls. We need to pay attention and respect those. Remember, just because this isn't an exact science doesn't mean that you can get away with cutting corners here. Audiences that like time travel stories, like yours truly, are usually pretty hip to the genre and can walk through the complex narratives and spot your continuity errors. Remember, we're talking about scientifically inclined, nerdy types. We love a good time travel story. As a brief overview, we're going to be talking about classic time machines, time travel powers, scientific time travel, and quantum realities. In every single one of these, we have an angry troll hanging over our head called the Paradox. Before we get to him, though, we'll go into some detail about how each of these methods of time travel works, and how we can get it messed up really bad. After that, we'll get into the angry troll ruining the continuity of our story. Now, we just mentioned our boy H.G. Wells and his wonderful story, The Time Machine. It doesn't matter if the vehicle is a sled, a DeLorean, or a magic school bus. If we're inside of a device explicitly for the purposes of time travel, we're in a time machine. For ease of use, we're going to say that the way we use time machines was already covered in previous world-building episodes with 2 major rule sets we played with. Our old friend, the Magic and Technology Wonder Scale, which states that something technological gets explained a bunch, so it gets to be useful. Time machines that aren't explained very well are more wondrous. I would avoid magical time machines for the same reason I mentioned earlier. The audience for this genre is pretty savvy. They like big explanations of your system, and it's actually part of the charm of the genre. The other element we're working with is that we've discussed before about tropes, cliches, and MacGuffins. Remember, if it could be an Egg McMuffin, it's a MacGuffin. This means we're after a thing, and when we get to do that thing, or get that thing, we win the story. Let's watch this in action. In Back to the Future, we have our DeLorean. We can go back in time on accident here, but now we can't get back home because we don't have the thing. So we're going to need to use another thing. We have to prepare for the thing. We overcome our nemesis who will stop us from getting into the thing, and then we get the thing and we win. So here's why you don't roll your eyes even after the 65th time you've watched it like I have. The system is technological, not wondrous. We understand that a nuclear charge is required to generate the energy that the car needs to make the time jump, but that technology wasn't available in 1955. So a lightning strike can produce that, but we just need to figure out how to harness that. We come up with a plan, we understand why it works, and then we're satisfied to see it in action. In between laughs and good times, we're fed little tidbits that explain the system, but it's buried in the dialogue. Marty is our everyman that gets the layman explanation and fills in the gaps for us. He guides us to understanding the system. The short version of this is to say that time machines let us do normal story arcs with rising and falling action, but we get to throw some science in there and play with history. Speaking of which, let's talk about my favorite guy rewriting history. This setup involves both the wondrous and the technological powers of time travel. In here we've got our Sam Beckett's and this guy, Dan Vassar. We'll get to him in a second because most people have never heard of him. These folks have time travel powers. They can't control it, so their storylines actually revolve around changing events in history. The story is propelled forward by figuring out what in history went wrong and fixing it. In this regard, it suits the classic fish out of water trope, with the character being disoriented, confused as we are, and stumbling their way into understanding the events that lead to this fork in time. Again, we're able to use normal story arcs with these powers. If anything, we have more freedom than normal because we can change settings whenever we want. This week it's an action story in Vietnam, and next week it's a romance on a farm in the 1980s. So it's deep cut time for an example here, and this time we're talking about the canceled before the first season ended 2007 NBC show Journeyman. Dan Vassar is a San Francisco reporter who develops this uncomfortable power to time travel. The problem is he literally vanishes from his present to live that period of the past. All the while he's juggling his mission in the past to change an event while trying to explain his alarming disappearances to his family and friends. This series had a lot of intrigue going into it. It was like a modern Quantum Leap. It just didn't attract the ratings fast enough, and the plug got pulled before the first full season aired, and was lost to the abyss of great ideas that couldn't pull ratings, like our brave captain of the Serenity. It brings a tear to the eye of this ancient master of Kung Fu and friendship, folks. One tiny, manly tear. So, let's say Back to the Future was a fun romp. Quantum Leap and Journeyman were novel and constantly reinventing their stories. They were focused on the story arc, and the tech played second fiddle. Not these science boys. No, sir. We want hardcore data, facts, and lots of technobabble and future speak. We want our science unfiltered and raw, and we're drinking it straight from the tap, concentrated. So, you probably know that I'm going to jump back to Interstellar. This movie uses such hard science that, to quote myself from a previous video, it made smart people feel dumb and dumb people hate it. It's a polarizing, love it or hate it kind of movie, and we can debate the merits of that until the end of time, but for lots of us science geeks, the nuts and bolts, the science of time travel, it all made sense. You might have to Google a few concepts and theories, maybe even watch a plot explanation on YouTube, but you get it. It's a meat and potatoes kind of science. You need to understand the potatoes have a gravity well, and the meat is a black hole where time and space fold in on itself. Doing hard science fiction, I wish you luck. A satisfying story arc usually suffers for it, and you become so niche that your audience shrinks real fast. Fear not, though. If you do nail it, you let me know. I'll check it out. We'll build a fort, and we'll hang out, and we'll be best friends, and I'll read your hard science time travel story, and then I'll tell you that we're all holograms in a simulation, and then there's 1,000 of us out there. Quantum realities is a tricky, relatively new take on time travel. Basically, the theory is that every decision every person ever makes creates a new reality. One where you made choice A, and another where you made choice B. As you can imagine, that means that there's an infinite number of worlds out there with an infinite number of slightly altered and drastically altered outcomes. What's funny about this is that, and we're going to get into and talk about paradoxes a little bit more shortly, is that this theory dodges paradoxes very well, because the world that you're living in isn't the same as the one you started from. Yeah, this gets confusing. We'll go more in depth shortly. For now, we're going to go with another deep cut here, and that's the 1990s TV series Sliders. The short version is child prodigy hero Quinn Mallory created a device that allows him to make portals to go to other realities. Unfortunately for him, Quinn and 3 other folks get sucked into one of his portals and they become lost in the multiverse. A lot like Quantum Leap and Journeyman, the series hinges on the group struggling to find a way to get home while doing missions in these other multiverse worlds. This particular series doesn't hold up very well to the test of time. It's got some pretty cheesy effects and some pretty unrealistic dialogue. And this unfortunate revolving door of writers and channels that ran the show, so there's a lot of inconsistencies. Still, it was one of the first sci-fi shows to embrace the multiverse of quantum realities, so good on them. It's worth at least checking out the first few episodes. So, we have one major hiccup that chases us around whenever we create time travel stories, and that's called a paradox. There are a couple of ways to look at it, so let's start with the textbook definition, which is when 2 contradictory events are true at the same time. It's a logic bomb waiting to explode in our stories. DC, we need more charts, you say, because you have a bad habit of talking to your screen. But I agree with you. Check it out. Let's say that we're out of nachos, but the grocery store is already closed. No problem. We'll go back in time 2 hours. The grocery store's still open, and we'll get our salty treats. Here's the problem. In 2 hours, we're scheduled to go back in time, but we already have our nachos, so there's no reason to go back in time. We erased the reason that we went back in the first place, but the reason must have existed because otherwise we wouldn't have gone back in time. See, I warned you this gets complicated. I know you're scared. It's going to be okay. Paradoxes are very difficult to avoid without embracing our buddy quantum realities, because the solution before that in sci-fi writing was largely to ignore paradoxes altogether. That means that we knew they were there, we just pretended they weren't. That's sloppy writing, and it's not what we're looking for. Basically, the best way to avoid a paradox is to avoid two contradicting truths at the same time. How do we do that? Plotting. Time travel stories are a lot like pizza. We know what we're asking for when we order it, and we know if we're getting a crappy one from the first taste. Plotting out good time travel takes a little finesse, a little logic, and maybe even some more charts. Yes, charts. I love them, and now you must love them. So let's take a look at an example of what's called a closed causal loop. A closed causal loop in time travel stories is basically where an event that happens in the future causes us to return to the past, only to return to the cause later on. We're stuck in it. Time doesn't move. Geez, that sounds complicated, DC. Fear not, it's easier than it sounds, mostly because that's the plot of Groundhog Day. Yeah, Groundhog Day is, at its heart, a time travel story. Every night, Bill Murray is going to fall asleep, and he is going to restart that day over again. The only way to break the cycle is to find the right way out of that day, which in this movie was to find love. Whatever. It was an adorable story and a funny movie. And I don't trust people that don't like this movie, by the way. The point is, you've seen causal loops in action. Causal loops don't run a high risk of paradox because it's basically a do-over of the same events. What about quantum realities? We have seen them before in simple and easy to understand bite sizes, right? Yes, absolutely. Here's Doc Brown explaining one right now. Here's Worf shifting back and forth between them for an entire episode. Here's an evil Spock from the Mirror Universe. Yep, the Mirror Universe is another word for a quantum reality. So, how do we avoid paradoxes with time machines? Oh, well, glad you asked. That's really easy. Don't go in the past. Time travel to the future. Traveling to the past makes all sorts of things about our reality true, but not so much about if we're traveling to the future. Isn't that right there, Marty, H.G. Wells, or Dr. Hartigan? This is a bit of a philosophical concept, but work with me here for a second. Personal motivation of your characters actually has a lot to do with creating paradoxes. The very desire to change the past is the start of a paradox. If we fail, we'll still want to do it and try again. That's a closed loop we discussed a moment ago. But if we succeed, we erase the motivation for time travel from history and make two things true. Then the gremlin comes and eats our cat. The lesson here is to avoid the desire to change the past as the motivating factor, and you kind of mitigate some of your risk for creating paradoxes. The only time that this can be elegantly avoided is if it already happened anyway. I know what you're saying. Oh god, now what does that mean? But I promise this is a simple concept. It's just hard to pull off. Basically, we're going to walk through the Star Trek Next Generation episode, Time's Arrow. The story here starts with the android character Data finding his own head in an ancient cave. This begins what you'd call a prophecy event, or just a good old Chekhov's gun, where at some point in the story, Data is going to be thrown back into the past, and his story will come to an end in that cave. He has an adventure in 1890 San Francisco, while his friends go back in time to save him from the fate of having his head chopped off. This is an open causal loop, because life and time goes on if we just leave this event alone. But since we know this future event, we can work toward changing it, and if we can't, well, that sucks. Unlike Groundhog Day and other closed loops, we really only get one shot to fix an open loop. We have to have our chance to go back and fix things, because if we fail, that's pretty much it. The stakes are a little bit higher, but that can usually be a good thing for the story. Again, these are super hard to do well, but for another example, I strongly recommend the movie Paycheck, again based on that legendary bastard Philip K. Dick. This movie has Ben Affleck as a reverse engineer who has the events of his project wiped from his memory. When he emerges from a year-long project that promised him millions, he finds he traded it for a bag of mundane random items. Each one of the items, however, fits the prophecy model that leads him to the answer of why he's traded his fortune away. It's a very satisfying film that wraps up pretty tight at the end, and another one of my absolute favorite movies in the genre. Time travel can be your best friend or your worst enemy. It's all in how you frame it, and as always, it should serve the telling of a good story. Without that, no amount of logic, systems, or world building can help you at all. Now, always remember, you can check out my latest videos at artofthearcane.com, where we're also going to start doing something a little bit new. Now, when you go to the world building section of artofthearcane.com and check out my latest videos, you can also see a longer, more detailed explanation of some of the things that we've talked about. So definitely go ahead and check that out on our blog. And you can also sign up for my newsletter and hear about the latest for the Wicked Instruments series and all sorts of other cool stuff. We're always doing big sci-fi and fantasy giveaways, so fill your e-reader with new books. Help out the master of Kung Fu and friendship by hitting that like and subscribe button to hear about new videos. As always, I'm DC Ferguson. Now have fun and get crafting.